All right, we're talking about the emergence of the urban culture in the Gilded Age, which is the modern culture we enjoy today. We talked about, last time about mass consumption. This time I want to talk about the emergence of popular culture. There was an increasing interest in leisure time activities because leisure time itself was expanding rapidly. The urban and middle and professional classes began to have evenings, weekends, and vacations. These were largely unknown before. In old agrarian times, you worked whenever you needed to, and no one took vacations. Now we have a regimentation of time, and so we have a separation of leisure and work time. Factory workers themselves, their work hours decreased from about 70 hours a week in 1860 to the high 50s in 1900. So even the proletariat has increased leisure time. Mechanization gave farmers more time. More and more people have an 8-hour workday. Now, it won't be until 1938 that that's mandated by law for everyone. But even a 10-hour day was an improvement. There was a compartmentalization between work and leisure time, in part emerging as a feature of American life because the separation of work and home was so acute. In the old days, if you were a farmer, your work and your home were the same thing. If you were a cobbler, work and home were the same thing. Now there's something very separate, and so leisure time activities emerge. Sports, in part, fill this leisure void, especially baseball. Contrary to popular belief, Abner Doubleday did not invent baseball. It was derived from a game called rounders, which was a variation on cricket. It began to appear in the early 1830s, became very popular, took off wildly in popularity after the Civil War, and became the, quote, national pastime, unquote. It became profitable after the war as well. The first salaried team were the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869. The National League was created in 1876. Everything happens in 1876. It had a great appeal to working class males who comprised the players and the spectators. Curiously, football, which emerged in the colleges, appealed to a more elite group because it was in the colleges and not that many people went to college in the Gilded Age, although that's changing. More about that later. The NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, was formed in 1910 to sort of govern football after Teddy Roosevelt called a White House conference in response to a rather violent season in 1905 that resulted in 18 deaths and 100 serious injuries. So football was made safer and continues to grow. Now, basketball really was invented by an educator named Dr. James Naismith in 1891. He invented basketball, became very popular very quickly. Boxing was, for most of the 19th century, considered highly disreputable and illegal in some states until after World War I. But it began to grow in popularity and respectability after the adoption of the Marquis of Queensberry rules. This guy on the right here is the Marquis of Queensberry, an English lord, who wrote these rules that included things like padded gloves and 3-minute rounds. And so there were far fewer deaths, and boxing becomes very popular. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt himself, the first great progressive president, trained himself to health from being a sickly child, in part because he partook in boxing. Now, this interest in sport was mostly a male thing, but women in colleges increasingly participated in sports. Now, the idea of women in colleges is a very new idea I'll talk about in the next lecture. But women started going to colleges in the 1890s, and they began to be involved in sports, certain sports, track, crew, swimming, basketball. Here we have the 1900 University of Minnesota Lady Golden Gophers playing in their skirts. Other leisure activities emerged in the cities because of the huge market for them. So this is another side of industrialization and urbanization and feeding each other. All these things I'm mentioning become themselves significant industries. The ethnic communities maintained their own theaters. As one example, Yiddish theater. Jews had Yiddish theater, and Plays would be performed in Yiddish, and this eventually translates into Yiddish radio, which survived until after World War II. A uniquely American art form called musical comedy evolved during this time. Operas had translated in Europe to something called the comic operetta, sort of a more accessible opera. And in America, this becomes the musical comedy. And it spawns a whole genre of music, which really is the father of our pop music. George Cohan is one example. He was a great Irish vaudeville entertainer who wrote a lot of songs, produced plays that created songs like Yankee Doodle Dandy, Over There, You're a Grand Old Flag. Vaudeville were these live variety shows, and perhaps one of the greatest examples was Florence Ziegfeld, an immigrant man who created a permanent vaudeville show called Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway. This is the forerunner of Broadway. If you've ever seen the movie Funny Girl, it's a true life story about a woman who was a star of the Ziegfeld Follies. So vaudeville will translate into what we think of as our modern pop culture. By the way, the songs of George Cohan and others, the sheet music was produced at a place in New York, a particular street, West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. It became known as Tin Pan Alley. And it was the Motown of its day. It was the first center of popular music in America. By the way, important point, vaudeville was open to African Americans. They performed in it and were often very popular, but they were in demeaning, stereotypical roles. But this is a way that African Americans start to wind their way into American culture and eventually will have a significant role. Now, until the invention of radio and television, the most important mass entertainment media, however, was the movies. Thomas Edison and others created the technology in the 1880s. By 1900, people were going in large numbers to the movies. The first movies were like, a 10-minute movie of a waterfall or a 10-minute movie of a train. Just the idea of watching a motion picture, people would pay to watch it. The first great director, however, was D.W. Griffith. He raised film to a new level with epics like The Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. It had very elaborate plotting and invented many of the conventions of film. Curiously, The Birth of a Nation, we'll talk about it later, it's a very white supremacist movie, and yet Intolerance is a movie condemning intolerance. It's kind of strange. The public quality of these entertainments was a striking feature. People were attracted by the energy of the crowd as well as the entertainment itself. People of very diverse backgrounds mix at these popular cultural activities, and this itself is a part of the emerging pop culture. Dime novels emerged at this time. These were genre fiction. As more and more people became literate, literacy spread enormously during the Gilded Age. More about that later. And so these very accessible novels began to emerge. There were no genres before this. There was not science fiction, detective stories, westerns, romances. These were invented as a part of the pop culture of the Gilded Age. The emergence of mass communications is also, like the emergence of mass consumption and mass popular culture, also occurred in this era. Newspapers grew at a rate much greater than the population growth from 1870 to 1910. For one thing, more and more people are literate. Quality improved, and journalism emerges as a distinct profession. Here's a whole other industry and a whole other new profession that enlarges the middle class. National press services emerge with the telegraph, creating more standardization and more quality in newspapers. The Associated Press, United Press International, sometimes you'll see those little taglines in articles. It means the article was grabbed off of one of these services to which the paper subscribes and just few changes made. So it created standardization, better quality, and newspapers themselves become a giant industry. Mass magazines emerged as promoters for mass consumption, and they were often directed at women, since women were the chief consumers. Ladies' Home Journal was launched in 1899 and is still popular today. Just one example of many mass culture magazines.